Welcome to this lesson on the Astra SIP terminals, config files, and administrator access. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the CFG files from an administrator point of view. We'll look at the astra.config. This is the file that's used to configure global settings on all of your phones. And then we'll look at the mac.config. There is a mac.config file for every SIP phone on your network. This is a unique file and is used to configure each individual phone. And I'll be using Astra's administrator guide as we go through the config files. This way you'll also learn how to use the administrator guide. Let's do a quick review of the four methods used to configure the phone and the hierarchy of these four methods. As we learned in the last module, the phone user interface and the web user interface have the highest level of priority when it comes to configuring the phone. These two methods update a file on the phone called the local.config. They require that we log into the phone in real time to update the parameters, and they're generally used to display and modify the parameters rather than to configure the initial setup. So now let's move on to the files that are generally used for the initial setup. They are the astra.config and the mac.config files. The configuration files are text-based. The extension ends in .cfg, that's why we call them config files. And these files are stored on a server referred to as the configuration server. The astra.config is used to configure global settings or settings that are common to all of the phones. An example of some of these settings are the IP address of the time server, proxy server, and register server, or configuring a soft key with your corporate directory or voicemail. The mac.config file is used to provide the unique configuration for each individual phone. The actual file name of the mac.config file will be the MAC address of a specific phone. As you can see in this example, the file 0008 ending in E55.cfg. That would be the MAC config for one specific phone that has this MAC address. I would use this file to configure individual lines. For example, line 1, line 2, line 3, and that would be things like the screen name, phone number, password. I can set up an individual soft key. For example, I might want to set up a speed dial number. Setting up paging zones and telling this phone to listen for a specific paging zone. I can set up the handset volume, ringer volume, and I can choose a preferred codec, such as the G.722 codec, so I can take advantage of Astra's high-Q wideband technology. These are just a few examples of what might be included in the config files. I told you we're going to use the administrator guide, so let me show you where you can get a copy for yourself. You'll need to go to www.astra.com. Then click on the Support tab. Click on Document Library, Desk Phones. Select any phone model. I'm going to select the 6757i. Now click on Setup and Administration and Administrator's Guide. This will display the most recent edition of the SIP Administrator Guide. At this point, you can click on the link and launch the Administrator Guide or save a copy locally on your PC. The manual has more than 1,000 pages and is roughly 30 meg in size, so this may take a while to download depending on your internet connection speed. The manual is in a PDF format and has a table of contents on the left. The appendixes in this manual are very helpful. Appendix A defines each parameter and the choices that can be set for that parameter. This is a very helpful reference section. Appendix C displays sample configuration files and demonstrates how parameters might be configured. We'll focus on Appendix C for the rest of the lesson. I'm going to look at a sample configuration for the 6757i. Like I said earlier, the configuration files are text-based. Let me read a couple of notes that are on this first page. The general format is similar to configuration files used by several Unix-based programs. On any line throughout the configuration file where a # character is used, any text following that # is considered a comment. The exception is if the # is contained within double quotes. Then it's considered to be a #. You might use this with your pound and star codes. And throughout the configuration file, we'll use 0 for false and 1 for true. On the next page, the first parameter that we see is DHCP. It's marked as a 1, and as we just saw, a 1 is true, so in this case, we're enabling the DHCP option. Our next parameter is network settings. There's a note that says, if DHCP is enabled, which it was from the last page, you do not need to set the network settings here. If DHCP was disabled, then we could set up the IP address, the subnet mask, default gateway, and DNS settings. Continuing on with time server settings, our next parameter is time server disabled. So, do you want to disable the time server, true or false? If we answer 0 or false, then we can input the IP address or domain name of the time server. The next parameter is NAT settings. If you were using a session border controller, you should set the outbound proxy to the session border controller address. We would set the following two settings. SIP outbound proxy. For our example, we've used sbc.astra.com. And then you want to put in a proxy port. A value of 0 enables SRV lookups for the address of the proxy. If you know the public IP address of your NAT device, and you've opened up a port for SIP messages, then you can statically assign this information. You would input the SIP-NAT IP address and the SIP-NAT port. The next parameter is additional network settings. This option allows you to define a SIP RTP port. Next, this section defines which servers the phone retrieves new firmware images and configuration files from. There are 3 protocols supported: TFTP, FTP, and HTTP. For the TFTP server settings, you would enter in the IP address of the TFTP server, and you have the option to enter an alternate TFTP server. If you chose to use the FTP server, you would enter in the IP address for the FTP server, the username, and a password. If you chose to use the HTTP server settings, you would enter in an IP address or a fully qualified domain name, and the HTTP path. The last parameter on the page is dial plan settings. As you dial a number on the phone will initiate the call when one of the following conditions are met. The numbers dialed are an exact match to the dial plan, the pound key was pressed, or a timeout occurs. The dial plan is a regular expression that supports the following syntax. You can match the keypad symbols, you can use a wildcard and match any digit, matches 0 or more repetitions of the previous expression, matches any number or number range inside the brackets, you can have expression grouping, or you can use an either-or condition. If the number dialed doesn't match the dial plan, then the call is rejected. On the next page, we'll start with general SIP settings. The first option is SIP Session Timer. We've been looking at each of the options in the sample configuration file. Let's say that you would like more information on a particular parameter. At the top of the page is a search field. I'll enter in SIP Session Timer. The search field will search forward from your current location, cycling through the document. Because I know Appendix A defines the parameters used in the configuration files, I'll want to begin my search at Appendix A. So in the table of contents, I'll click on Appendix A to take me to that location. Then I'll click on the Find Next icon to begin my search from this location. On the left, we see the parameter name is SIP Session Timer. However, on the web user interface, it's just called Session Timer. On the right side, it shows us in the web user interface the path where this parameter is found. For example, this path is Advanced Settings, Global SIP, Advanced SIP Settings. It also shows us that this parameter can be configured in both configuration files. If we look at the description, it tells us that this parameter is the time in seconds that the IP phone uses to send periodic reinvite requests to keep the session alive. The proxy uses the reinvite requests to maintain the status of the connected sessions. Continuing down, we see that the format is an integer, that's a whole number. The default value is 0, 0 being false or disable. Range is not applicable. And in this example, it shows SIP Session Timer equals 30 seconds. So now if you need more information about a parameter that's in the configuration files, I've showed you how to search by keywords and how to use the table of contents to begin your search at a specific location. For my example, I chose Appendix A, but this manual is over 1,000 pages and there's a lot of useful information. So if you don't find what you're looking for in this section, let your search cycle through the rest of the manual. We also saw in Appendix A It shows where the parameter is located, a description, the default setting, and an example. Now let's return and continue with the configuration file. The next parameter is SIP transport protocol. This parameter defines what protocol is used for SIP messaging. Your choices are UDP, TCP, or both. Next is SIP basic codecs. If you want to limit the codecs to only using G711 and G729, then you would set this parameter to 1. The next parameter is SIP out-of-band DTMF. By default, this is turned on. Setting this parameter to a 0 would disable the feature. Setting it to a 1 would enable it. The next parameter is Global SIP User Settings. These settings are used as the default configuration for the hard key lines on the phone. For a 6757i, we would have 4 hard line keys. These settings can be overridden on a per-line basis using the per-line settings. So let's go through the different parameters. First is SIP screen name. This is the name that's displayed on the phone's screen. Next is SIP username. This is the phone number. Then SIP display name. This is the caller name that's sent out when you make a call. Then SIP voicemail, the number that's used to reach voicemail. Then SIP auth name. This is the account name used to authenticate the user. And then you have SIP password, which is the password for the authentication account. Next is SIP mode, which defines the line type. Next we have SIP proxy IP and SIP proxy port. This is the IP address or fully qualified domain name of the proxy and the port that is used for SIP messaging on the proxy. And last is the SIP register IP, which is the IP address or fully qualified domain name of the register server, the SIP register port, and the SIP registration period, which is in seconds. Following the global SIP user settings is per-line SIP settings. In this example, it configures line 3 with support for a BroadSoft CSA line. The proxy and register settings are taken from the previous global settings. So I'll fill in the screen name, username, display name, auth name, password, mode, and voicemail number. I can repeat this process for any additional lines that I need to configure. The last parameter that we'll look at is programming soft keys. Soft keys can be set server-wide or unique to each phone. Remember, if we want a parameter to be server-wide, we'll put it in the astra.config file. And if we want it to be unique, then we'll put it in the mac.config file. There are a maximum of 18 soft keys that can be configured on the 6757 iPhone. Each soft key needs to be numbered from 1 to 18. There are 4 fields we can use when we build soft keys. They are soft key line types, soft key label, soft key value, and soft key line. The choices for soft key types are line, speed dial, busy lamp field, list, and do not disturb. Depending upon your call control system, or PBX, you may have additional types, for example XML. For this lesson, I'll focus on this list. The soft key label can have a maximum of 10 characters if I'm using speed dial or do not disturb, and 9 characters for line and busy lamp field. If my soft key type is speed dial, then my soft key value can be any of the characters on a standard dial pad, 0 through 9, star, and pound. I can also use a comma for a 500 millisecond pause. If the soft key type is busy lamp field, BLF, then I'll just put in the extension number that I want to monitor. And soft key line. If applicable, this is the line that will be used to support the feature being programmed on a soft key. So here's what I'd put in the config file. Soft key 1, type, speed dial. On the next line, soft key 1, label, whatever the label I want to be. In this case, it's ext pickup. Then on the third line, soft key 1, value, and then you put your value in there. For this case, it's star 8. Let's look at soft key 2. Soft key 2, type, speed dial, soft key 2, label, call return, soft key 2, value, star 69. These 2 examples are for adding features, but I could also use just a plain old speed dial number, and I could put in a phone number in there. The next type is do not disturb. So for this one, soft key 4, type, DND or do not disturb, and then soft key 4, label, DND. To add an additional line key, I would use 3 lines, and I would put soft key, and for this example 6, type, line. Then on the next line, soft key label, and I put a label on there. We're using test 1 for this example. And then soft key 6, line, and then I'll put the line I want to use. Okay, let's look at how to set up a busy lamp field. Soft key 8, type, BLF, soft key 8 label, and then I'll label it. Here I'm using Jane Doe, and then the value, soft key 8 value, will be the extension I want to monitor. And for this type, I'll need to define a line. So that would look like soft key 8, line 1. And then to set up a soft key for my callers list, which is like a call log for incoming calls, I would put soft key 11, type, list. Before we move on, I just want to give you a quick reminder about the pound sign. Many of the examples that we've looked at in the sample configuration file have been preceded by a pound sign. And we learned that any characters that follow a pound sign are considered comments and are not used in the configuration. So if you copy any of the examples listed here and use them in your own configuration files, be sure to remove the pound sign. What I want to do now is to pull up a couple of configuration files that we use here in the training department. To view the configuration files, use any text-based editor. The Astra config file has all your global settings. Parameters that I'll set in this file are things like enable the web user interface, set timers, set up codec selection defaults, set IP addresses and ports for various servers, set star codes for special features, and where to send any status or summary reports. So anything that I put in this file will affect all of the phones. Now let's look at a Mac config file. Every phone will have its own mac.config file. This is the file that gives each phone its unique configuration. If you look at the file name, you'll see that the file name is made up of the MAC address. This MAC address belongs to a specific phone. The first thing that you may see in the config file are administrator notes. These lines would be commented out. You might want to put information in here that would be helpful for an administrator or a technician that would look at this file at a later date. As we move down, let's look at the configuration for this phone. Some things we might see are an administrator password, IP and port server information, Ethernet port, VLAN, and NAT information, dial plan, headset and handset levels, audio mode. You'll have line or account information, which will define your screen name, username, display name, password, mode, proxy IP address and port, register IP address and port, and voicemail. I'll repeat this process for each line assigned to the phone. The next thing that you'll see are the parameters for the soft keys. We'll look at the bottom soft keys first. You can see here my first 3 soft keys are assigned XML applications. As I scroll down, soft keys 6 through 10 have been set up to provide paging capabilities. The way our paging is set up is that we have 4 zones plus a 5th page all zones. And my phone can page all 4 zones individually, or I can page all zones. Soft keys 7, 8, 9, and 10 will page zones 1, 2, 3, and 4. And soft key number 6 will page all zones. To set up the paging, I'll fill in 3 lines for each soft key: type, label, and value. The type is paging. The label is text-based. You have 10 characters, so keep it short, but try to label it with something that'll make sense. And the value is the IP address and port of that paging zone. So that's how to set up the soft keys to make a page. Now we need to set up the phone to tell it which pages to receive or to listen for. This is a single line command and can be put anywhere in the configuration file. My listen command has been put in between soft key 7 and soft key 8. So my phone will receive pages that have the IP address of 239.0.1.20 port 10,000 and 239.0.1.21 port 10,000. So that's how you set up paging. First you set up any soft keys you want to be able to be pushed to make a page, and then you will add the listen command, which will include the IP addresses and port of the pages you want to receive. We'll continue and scroll down the mac.config file. The last thing that we'll see are the top soft keys. The top soft keys have the same rules and are programmed like the bottom soft keys. The first soft key is programmed with a callers list, and soft keys 2 through 5 are programmed with various XML applications. The file that I've shown you here today was just a sample and a guideline to get you started. I would recommend that you download and use the administrator guide to help you customize your config files. In this lesson, we looked at the configuration files from an administrator point of view. We looked at the astra.config, which allowed us to set our global settings, and the mac.config, which allowed us to set parameters for a specific phone. I also showed you where to find the administrator guide and how to download it. Then, using the table of contents, we jumped to Appendix C. We spent a lot of time in Appendix C looking at sample configurations. Then I demonstrated the keyword search, where we looked up additional information on a specific parameter. This took us to Appendix A, where we saw detailed information and settings for each parameter. For more information on config files, and to be able to download the administrator guide, go to www.astra.com.